Online for Authors, where I, Teri M Brown, author of character-driven fiction and host of the podcast, introduce readers to characters they'd love to invite to lunch by interviewing authors, discussing their books, learning about the writing process, and even, on occasion, chatting live with a panel of authors to discuss topics relevant to both readers and writers. My guest today on the Online for Authors podcast is Van Haney, author of the books Stories to Curl Your Toes and Bloody Ever After. Vanessa grew up in the new age circus known as the entertainment industry. She was first published in an anthology of poems in 1997. In the early 2000s, she was showcased in young filmmaker competitions for her screenplays. And in 2018, while getting her master's in education, she self-published her first book of short stories, Stories to Curl Your Toes. Now, after 2 children and a move to the Pacific Northwest, she's unleashing her stories into the world once again. Today, she's going to chat with us about things she learned about the film industry that has helped her with her writing. Today on Online for Authors, I'm chatting with Van Haney. She's author of Stories to Curl Your Toes and Bloody Ever After. However, today she's here to talk about working in the film industry, which she did for many years, and the lessons that she kind of learned that she's taken away into her author career. So welcome, Van.
Hi, thanks for having me.
I am so excited to have you with me today. So why don't you just give us a really quick bio, a little bit about your books, just kind of like introduce yourself to everyone, and then we'll just dive in.
Okay, so I write horror primarily, sometimes supernatural, sometimes more realistic or body horror. In general, I really gravitated towards it from a young age. My mom was a prosthetic makeup artist in the film industry. So we watched a lot of horror films. She worked on a lot of horror films, and it became kind of a staple in our house. And I think that really led me into that kind of macabre, bizarre genre. I started writing when I was very, very young, and I was first published when I was in the 4th grade in a children's anthology. In high school, I won a bunch of screenwriting awards in teen video film festivals. And then I went to film school. And I was 4th generation in the film industry. So my great-grandfather, grandfather, and grandmother, my parents, and then I were all in the film industry. And I think that really shaped my love of dialogue and conversation. And it led to me eventually getting into writing novels and working more on my craft as a writer.
Right. So I do want to just kind of put out there that Van came to me, I'd heard about it and said, "Hey, I've got these books." And I had to say, "Oh, Van Hun, I can't read horror. I just can't. Like I don't have anything against it. I can't read it. Otherwise I don't sleep for days. Like it is just a bad fit for me." So I really wanted to talk with you. So if you're a horror, like that's your genre, definitely head right out. I understand they're fabulous. I can't attest to it by having read it myself because I'm still sitting here and I wouldn't be. I'd have to be medicated. I can't read it. But I think that's great that's what you gravitated toward. So you grew up, you stated in your bio that you grew up in a new age circus known as the entertainment industry. What exactly do you mean by that? What is your description of this new age circus?
So I started acting at the age of 3. I was on General Hospital and I was on Diagnosis Murder. And I did quite a bit of acting. And both my parents were in the industry. My dad worked at Warner Brothers for 25 years. And my mom, like I said, was a prosthetic makeup artist. She worked on television and film. And one of the things that they call all of the trailers and everything for film sets is a circus.
Okay.
And I call it the New Age Circus because very much like a circus, you are traveling around in these caravans you end up all different parts of the world. My mom has worked in Dubai. She has worked in Hungary. She has worked all over. And so did my dad when he was working on films. He would work in Mexico and Panama and all these places. So it was, to me, a new age circus. You are picking up everything. You are packing to travel with all of these people who you are working with and living in a community with. And that's it. Like, it is bringing entertainment to the masses through a caravan of people.
Yeah, I think that's great because I don't think I'd ever thought of it. In my mind, the film industry lives in Hollywood. And that's just what you do. You just live in Hollywood. And it's not that. I mean, it can be that, but that's not that. There's a lot of movement around. So that's great. It also said that you started by writing poetry and then you did like some screenplays, some short stories. How did your time in the film industry doing this, travel and seeing all that you saw, how did that shape all of that? Or I'm assuming that it did. I can't imagine having those experiences and not have that come out in what you did.
Yeah, I think that being in the film industry from a young age really requires you to grow up quickly. You're encouraged to be more of an adult than a child at all times. And I think that there's some benefits and some downsides to that. One of the few benefits that I think comes from that is my understanding of language and communication, my openness to hear people's stories, and that I think is what really shaped me. So I started with writing poetry. It was all fantasy based poetry. And everything was very like happy and fantasy based. I was very young. And I think from there, I really entered that awkward age of like not being able to get a lot of roles, somewhere around like 11, 12. And that's when my parents were like, oh, you should consider directing. But in order to direct something, I had to write something. So I started to write screenplays. And it was my screenplays that got recognized more than my directing. I wish I had realized this like before I finished film school, because I probably would have become a screenwriter instead of focusing on directing. But I was recognized for screenwriting, and a lot of that came from the dialogue. So the dialogue is extremely important in screenwriting.
Right.
Everything is told through the visual pictures and through the words that people are saying. And as a writer, you're handing over your story to a director. And that director is then using their vision of your story to make the film. So writers have a limited amount of control over what the story ends up being. In most cases, obviously, the most famous of screenwriters have a little bit more control. Yeah. But in most cases, you really lose control when you hand it over to a director. But something that you do control is what the actors say and how they are perceived and deliver those lines. Like the timing of how a conversation works, what is put into that conversation, the way it's worded can really dictate how the performances happen. And I think that that is where I sort of came from as a writer. I spent a lot of time acting, so I understood the importance of the dialogue. And I spent a lot of time talking with people on set, a lot of adults, hearing their stories, people of all different generations, all different backgrounds. The film industry is such a melting pot of people that it's interesting to just get to know them and hear from them. And that started to shape my idea of how to build characters. Something that is common in my stories, whether it's a short story or a novel, is that level of dialogue. So I use a lot of dialogue to push the story forward rather than using a lot of exposition. And that definitely comes from the experience I have with screenwriting and being on set.
So as I'm a character-driven fiction author, like I love character, and I have found that I have a lot of trouble. I have to actually go back. I'm constantly being told by my editor, we need you to tell us a little more about what things look like. And I'm like, just imagine it in your head and move on. Like, I don't, because when I read, I prefer, I've read books before that I've enjoyed the storyline, but I'll skip 2 or 3 pages and get back to the dialogue. I want to know what they're doing. Or,
Okay.
or at least I want the in their head dialogue. I want to know what they're thinking. And it's like, you're going to give me 2 pages of describing the mountains. I don't care. Like, I want the story. So I tend to be a little more dialogue driven myself. I feel that's where my strengths are. However, I do a lot of in my head dialogue, which would make it almost impossible for a screenplay. And I've wondered how that would happen. Like, how would you take a book like I've written that, 30 to 40% of the dialogue is in their head, and how do you get those thoughts out into a screenplay? Like, I don't even know how that works.
Well, that would be probably a lot of additional scenes added
Right.
to get those things across, and probably a lot of like facial expressions and things like that. Maybe narration. You could have the narrator kind of talking through what's happening.
Right.
But yeah, probably a lot of additional scenes, I would say. One of the things that actually I would say is a benefit from spending 4 years thinking I wanted to be a director is the idea of being able to visualize a story. So when I am writing a story, I'm a pretty fast writer. And I would say it's because I watch it in my head as I'm typing. So a lot of people say like that their characters talk to them, and my characters don't talk to me. My characters perform. My characters just do what they're doing, and I write it as I see it, and that's how it works for me. And I think that a lot of that is because I grew up in the film industry, so everything to me is so visual. So I want my readers to visualize the movie that I'm seeing play out.
Do you have trouble like describing what you're seeing? Because in a screenplay, you've written screenplays, you don't have to describe the room because the room is going to be visible. Right?
Yeah.
So I'm just curious if that has translated, or if you really do just like watch it and go, oh, well, I'm looking right now at the yellow wall, and so I'm going to write that down.
Yeah. So sometimes for me, I do have to pause and be like, okay, how do I describe what this person looks like? Because when you're writing a screenplay, you're going to be like 43, brown hair, thin, like it's very basic in your description. And for writing, obviously, a novel, I needed to be a lot more detailed. So I will be like, what do I see this person looking like? So in my head, I'm picturing this person. I'm writing out like, what is it that I'm seeing of them? I think that the environment is easier for me in a lot of ways because I did a lot of production design. And so all of that comes from the idea of like, what would this room look like? What would this, parking lot be like? How would it feel? Why would it feel that way? What gives you those feelings? So I think that that's easier for me to describe. I think that sometimes the people, I'm like, what is too much? What is not enough? What can she tell about, like, for this new main character, what can she tell about the person that isn't like too much information that she wouldn't actually know? So
and too much information that your reader doesn't need to know. Because sometimes we have to think about, I could sit and describe, for instance, the room that you're sitting in, and we could get into very detailed about the books that are behind you. And like, we could get really into it, but how much of that is necessary? Is it sufficient to say that Van is sitting in front of a bookcase filled with books?
So like you, I am not a fan of flowery, verbose descriptions. Just not a fan of it. I know plenty of people who are, and I think that like I love reading horror and thriller and mystery, and I have tried reading a lot of Gothic fiction, and sometimes I love it. Like Mexican Gothic was great, but sometimes it really errs on that side of like too much
Too
description.
much. Right.
And I get really bored of that. And I would say that my writing tends to be very action oriented. Like I want to keep moving that story forward. And sometimes I think maybe I don't have enough of inside your head because I'm like, okay, what would be the next thing that they would do? How would they feel? Okay, what would be the next thing?
So it's interesting. So you have that probably from being in the film industry, that it's action, move forward, because that's what has to happen in most films. Is what's going next? What's going next? It can't be this slow, lazy kind of thing. It's got to capture their interest. And then I have the, oh my gosh, I'm in her head so much that I've got to get out and move this story forward. My last book that I put out, when I first went to the editor, she got back to me and she said, well, when I finally got through it, the story is wonderful, but I went through half your novel before I had any real clue where we were headed. You wandered too long. You've got to give me more sooner. So I ended up taking a chapter that I had written more in the middle of the book, and I pulled it to the front kind of as a flash forward. And then I went back and told the story that got us to that point and moved on. And it worked. It fixed the problem. But I have just the opposite problem, where it's like I'm so in their head, and it's like, don't we all want to know what she's thinking, So yeah, that's interesting. If you were to talk to another author who is saying, I'm trying to write books, I just struggle, are there any tips that you've learned along the way that you would think would really be beneficial to help new authors in particular?
I run a writers group in my city.
Awesome.
So we do have a lot of conversations. I'm one of the few people who has published books. So that has, I would not consider myself an expert, but that has lifted me to some sort of level in the group.
Elevated your status significantly, right? Yeah.
But I would say, so one of the things that's really hard with new writers is they have to figure out if they're a plotter or a pantser, right? That is one of the hard things, that when people come to the group and they're like, I'm aspiring to be a writer, I'm like, great. How do you write? Because that's really going to be how you determine what information to take from this group and what you don't. So I personally am a plotter. I spend a lot of time pre-thinking out what's going to happen in the story, so that when I am visualizing the story happening, I know where I'm going, and it just sort of flows through that. But if you're a pantser, like a lot of the ways that I write also would work. It's just that you have to go back and fix a lot of things as it happens.
And I'm a pantser. I am very much a pantser, which is why I wander and get lost in the woods, and I'm wandering around, and it's like, oh, now I know where I'm going. And then I do have to go back and fix things, because I'm trying right now. I'm writing a manuscript, and I tried plotting a little more, because I thought, well, this is going to help me. And it's horrible. And I've had to back off. No, I've had to back off. I haven't written in about 3 weeks on it. And I'm just kind of letting it sit over there, because as I've been thinking about it, there are things I need to move and change because they don't fit me anymore. I was trying so hard to keep it in these limits that I lost my voice. It doesn't sound like me anymore. And it's like, oh, what happened? So I am obviously very much a pantser.
Sounds like it.
And then I'll just have to go back and fix, and that works for me. And I thought that maybe I needed to be a plotter, but I don't, because it doesn't work. It doesn't work for me. So yeah, so that would be the first thing, is figuring it out, what works for you, right?
For sure. The one thing that I would say, I really think it is important. A lot of people, they'll always tell you to read the genre that you write, that you write, which for me is easy. I've always read a lot of horror and thriller and mystery. So that hasn't been hard. But I would say, in addition to reading what you like to write, you should also watch movies and TV related to it. So, And maybe not even like, I don't always watch horror films. I don't watch every horror film that comes out. There are some horror TV shows that I like, but I don't watch every horror TV show. But one of the things that you can get from watching at least some variation, so maybe I watch like comedy horror, like the show Ghosts, or something like that. But what you get is those tropes that are so commonly found in every type of media related to that genre. And I think that that's really important. We just talked about that in my writing group, that, what tropes are associated with your genre. And a lot of people didn't know what I was talking about. And when you are sending a query letter or you are releasing your book, knowing what tropes you have in it is really important. And so being able to identify tropes and variations of tropes can be beneficial for your writing, and film is a shorter way in which to gather those, because a book could take you 20 hours to read, but this movie takes you an hour and a half.
Right. And in that hour and a half, you can say, okay, so this is what happens. You know, like I'm very familiar with romance tropes. I know what happens in a romance trope. You can guarantee that that's what's going to happen. I write historical fiction, but I tell people I write character-driven fiction that happens to be set in historical times. I don't know what I am. And I have a harder time finding tropes in historical fiction. I think historical fiction tends to be a little more broad, like a little more open. It's a little harder to pinpoint what's happening here. I don't know.
Overlaps with like romance and stuff, right?
I think there is. A lot of times,
hero,
historical
villain.
Yes, a historical fiction too often has maybe more of a love story in it somewhere. Not necessarily the romance trope itself, but there is that love story overtone is often thrown in there as well. So, yeah, you're right. You do have to look for those. And I agree that watching them on television is a faster way of kind of getting a feel for like, what are people expecting?
Right.
Because that's what a trope does, is it helps people know generally what they're going to get.
Right. Like if I'm doing a slasher, I'm going to want to, think about, is there a final girl? So who is that final girl? Is she this, you expect her to be the like really naive, innocent one who ends up surviving everything? Is my first death going to be the promiscuous girl? Is the nerd going to help them along to survive at some point? Am I going to have that final battle where they think they killed the monster mass murderer guy, or is it going to be that we know that he's not dead? Is he going to be impossible to kill? So all of those things that I have to think about as I'm writing something that's a slasher. In this case, my new book that's coming out is about Upior. So they're like the predecessors to vampires. And there is some information out there about them. So I did some research on what that is. But I also, kind of messed with it a little to kind of create my own variation. And, what does that look like in today? Am I following that kind of hero's journey? What kind of formatting am I going to follow for this story? So thinking about all of those and, what tropes are actually going to be involved in this story.
Right.
So, it's.
No, I think that's great information. Do you have any other tips to consider? Or for instance, what about an author who has written a book and they say, "Oh, I would love to write a screenplay of my book." What are they looking at? What do they need to consider with that?
Well, my other advice for authors, new authors or seasoned authors, is you can also watch films to gather how people speak. And I think that that's really important. And often when I am reading people's work, one of the things that I will pick up on is how consistent are you with the way in which certain characters speak, and how does that define who they are? So if you start out with a character who clearly is using like colloquialisms and is like this Southern character. The story needs to continue with that character speaking that way. And if they suddenly are saying things that are very modern, I'm going to be taken out and be like, what happened? That's not who they are. And I think that film is really good for that also, to give you an idea of how dialogue works and how people have conversations. I actually wanted to do a video on this for my TikTok, but I'm not sure. My audience is all ghost stories. I tell ghost stories on TikTok. Every now and then I talk about writing, and it's not nearly as popular as the ghost stories. So, but one of the things I was thinking about was when you have a conversation, a lot of times that conversation is somebody asks a question, the other person answers, then the person who asked it answers back with kind of their own like analogy or story. And then that person comes back with another story. And generally a conversation goes back and forth where it almost doesn't make sense from the outside, but from the inside, it's two people sharing experiences about the same thing and then coming back to address what the other person said. But when you're writing, that type of dialogue doesn't necessarily make sense as a reader. So you wouldn't have a scene in which two people are talking and one tells a story and then the other one responds with a story and then that one responds. Like you wouldn't do that. No one would want to read that, even though that's how we generally talk. So I think that it's important to be able to pick out the parts of conversation and how people speak to each other and be able to adapt that to writing. And I think that screenwriting and novels are very similar in the fact that there are things you need to take out of a conversation that allow the story to move forward and that makes sense in terms of how two people would talk. But you also need to leave out some of those more intricate things that people do. And so film is a great way to see a conversation that makes sense and works.
I agree. I think that's great. I know that when I'm writing conversation, one of the things that I'll do is I will speak it out loud.
Yes.
Like, how did that sound? I was reading a book for someone the other day, and I won't say who or anything, but the dialogue jolted me out every single time we got to it because it felt very stilted and awkward. And I kept thinking, they wouldn't talk like this. It was supposed to be a man and woman who were in love. And it was just, I don't know. It just wasn't, I thought, no two people. If a man were talking to me this way, I'd get back on the plane and I would head back to New York. Like I'd be, like I'm done. This is crazy. And so I think it's good to listen. So not only to your own words where you can say them out loud, but to go and listen to even audio books will help with that too. Yes. Hearing out loud, what does that sound like?
One of the last things I do before I release my book is I read the entire thing out loud to myself to see if I like stumble over words, if something seems weird, if like maybe there's no transition between two things. And in my head, it sounds fine, but reading it out loud, that's when I realize like, okay, doesn't work.
Not so good. Well, this is interesting. So I had Daughters of Green Mountain Gap came out in January, but I got it on audiobook just recently. Like it just happened in July. And so I was listening to her reading it. Tracy Odom is my narrator, and she was reading it, and I was supposed to be following along with my book and, making any changes. And I found errors in my that I didn't know were there, that it's been through, it's been through my editing and it's been through my proofing. It's been through all of that, and hearing it out loud, it was like, oh, mistake. Ooh, error. So there is something really good about the auditory reading out loud to help with that kind of thing. So.
Definitely. And I personally, I have found errors in many professionally released, published books, traditionally published books still have errors. I think that's an important thing for authors to think about, is that every time I find an error in something that's already been put out into the world, I have to remind myself that it happens to everyone.
It happens. Yeah.
It doesn't matter if it's like Simon and Schuster or, whoever. It
Right.
doesn't matter because there are still going to be errors.
So what happens is we tend to read what we know is we meant to put on the page, and and they slip through. They just slip through, and they can slip through even if I know people who've spent money to have like it proofed 4 different times, and they get it out there and there's still errors because that's just what happens. But yeah. Wonderful.
The other thing that I would tell authors is, yes, read lots of things within your genres, but also try to identify the authors that are similar to you. Like Stephen King is famous in the horror community, right? Everybody knows Stephen King. Everybody, whether you like horror or not, has probably read a Stephen King book, or at least seen Stephen King movies. I actually battle with whether or not I like Stephen King's work, partially because of the over descriptions that he tends to have. But also, like, sometimes it's just slow for me. But then there's authors like Grady Hendrix, who, he is very action oriented. His stories move along. You get some inside narration, some idea of who they are, but also like he keeps it moving. And I think that being able to identify authors that you kind of write similar to is helpful too, to just be able to also see their format. So I spent a lot of time looking at his formats for his novels, and he really tends to follow like the same plot structure. Totally different topics, totally different stories. Only because I'm sitting there analyzing, having read like 4 in a row, do I notice. But I think that is helpful, especially when you're new, trying to figure out how to tell the story in a way that's interesting. Reading somebody who you think maybe you write similar to can really help with that.
I agree. I also want to throw out there, though, that I have found that reading some genres that are different than what I write also helps me because I see things differently. Like, just because you write horror or just because you write, historical fiction or whatever it is, doesn't mean that you can't learn from an author who writes a different genre. And it might be a way to add a little bit of a twist, a little tiny something that kind of gives your book an edge that you wouldn't have otherwise, having read something in a different genre. So I definitely agree, like, focus on what it is you're writing on, but don't be afraid to reach outside the box a little bit and just see what's going on in the rest of the world.
So. Since I teach, I think I don't even think about that because I have to read all of these other books.
Right.
So to me, it's like, I'm always having to read all of these other books. So I'm like gravitating when I can towards something darker. But yeah, I definitely agree that it's really important to read other things. I'm reading a book right now that's like a YA book about schizophrenia, and it's called Challenger Deep by Neil Schusterman, and totally different genre. It is a YA, I guess in some ways fantasy, but it's just a YA fiction really. And there's a lot that I'm getting out of it. Just the idea of, I don't know if you know Bizarro genre, but I wrote in this niche genre for a little bit, Bizarro, and it really is like absurd and doesn't make a lot of sense. And a lot of his book, because it's about a kid with schizophrenia, it falls into that Bizarro, and it's told in a non-linear way. And I think that all of that is something that I'm really like enjoying reading and trying to like learn from and grasp, like, how did he do this? And what is the reader getting out of this? And I think for me, it's made it really interesting. And I hope that for the student who I'm working with, it also is interesting. But
that's always the goal, right?
I talk with them tomorrow, so we'll see what they say.
Well, fantastic. So I know that you're working on something. Tell everybody really quickly what it is you're working on.
So I am working on a book that is currently called Safest in the Light. It is a novel about a party girl with the perfect LA lifestyle. She's out every weekend with her friends partying, and they invite people to kind of join their group randomly, and they invite some guys that seem like a lot of fun to be a part of their group as they go out and do things. And things get out of control, and she ends up impregnated with a hybrid baby and being chased so that they can kill her and the baby. So you will find out what causes that, what the group is, what they're really after. And she enlists the help of a rookie cop and the Celestial Research Society to help her try and get away from this group that wants to kill her.
Wow, sounds really good. And that will be coming out in October, you said, right?
Yes.
Wonderful. Well, hey, listeners, if you want to keep up this book discussion, head on over to Novels and Latte Book Club. It's on Facebook. And as a member of the group, you're going to have the opportunity to win a digital copy of Van Haney's book, Safest in the Light. It will be in October. She's going to need some art greeters, but you'll go ahead and get on her list. So head on over there and sign up. The links are down in the show notes. So Van, if someone wanted to get up with you and chat with you a little bit more, or, find out some more tips or learn more about your horror books, how do they do that? How do they reach out?
So they can follow me on social media. On Instagram, I am Dystopian Ness. And on TikTok, I am Van Haney Books. If you follow me on TikTok, I tell ghost stories. So wherever I am, whatever I'm doing, I will tell ghost stories from the area. And on Instagram, cool pictures, stories about what I'm doing.
Super. Well, I'll have those in the show notes as well.
I do my own giveaways sometimes too.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah.
For books that I might do. When I finish this book, I'm going to do a giveaway for a copy of my first 2 books.
Fantastic. So definitely follow Van, and you'll see that in the show notes. I want to thank you so much for being with me today. This has been an awesome time.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right. Bye now.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to Online for Authors, where I, Teri M Brown, author of character-driven fiction and host of the podcast, introduce readers to characters they'd love to invite to lunch. Tune in next Tuesday for another podcast episode.